to take a look at Miriam as we continue our study of women in the Bible, and maybe to start with, what do we know about Miriam? What are you? To what degree are you acquainted with Miriam? Who was she?
Moses' sister.
Moses' sister. And she gave him a hard time one time. Yes. Okay. So we know she's Moses' sister. We know, like all sisters, she gave her brother a hard time at least once. But we also know something else, that she was kind of helpful to her brother. In what way was she helpful to Moses?
Well, after Moses' mother put him into the river in the basket, she told Miriam, although she's not named at that point.
She is not named.
She's just his sister.
It could presumably be another sister, but we assume it's Miriam, yes.
She followed and watched as the basket went down the river, and then when she saw Pharaoh's daughter take the basket, she went over and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse him, and Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and she went and got her own mother, and so
very important player.
she had Moses back again.
Yes, exactly. She was looking after baby brother, right? And following that little basket down the river, and make sure that Moses has what he needs, and is able to and that her mother can, as you said, can be with him. Miriam, I think, is a kind of an interesting character, and I think. Well, let's just read a little bit about Miriam. Anybody else have comments about Miriam before we get started here?
Typical big sister, you know.
Typical big sister.
Boss and a little younger brother.
All right.
See some of that later. They're watching after.
Okay.
I was thinking more that it's so sweet to see little girls who want to be helpers, and there are very few little girl stories in the Bible that I can recall anyway.
And I think that's why one of the reasons Miriam makes a lot of appearance in Sunday school classes. It's a nice little girl story that perhaps especially little girls that maybe have baby brothers or baby sisters can relate to, and so so it often makes appearances in Sunday school. Her getting leprosy later in life doesn't usually make the Sunday school curriculum, but we can talk
Been on the flannel graph many times.
Right.
Well, she could also sing and dance.
She could also sing and dance, apparently. Yeah. I want to start with a mention of Miriam that maybe you weren't familiar with, and aren't, unless you read the text that I suggested for you. Micah 6 verse 4. Does somebody want to read Micah 6 verse 4 for us?
I'll find Micah first. One of those little books.
Hosea, Joel, and
Very smart.
Micah, what?
6:4.
I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam.
So I just thought that was sort of an interesting text on Miriam, and I'm not sure that I knew it was there until I started reading some about Miriam and digging into Miriam a little bit. I'm not sure I was aware of that text before. Why was I not aware of that text? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? That Micah mentions Aaron and Miriam in the same breath as he mentions Moses. And actually, the NIV sort of even minimizes it more than literally, it's more like, I redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Moses gets the first mention, but Aaron and Miriam are also considered very important in that Exodus. And God, this is significant because God is making his case against Israel in Micah chapter 6. He's saying, you know, I got a real problem with you people. And one of the reasons I have a problem with you is I brought you out of Egypt and I sent you these leaders to lead you in the desert and to lead you to the promised land. And those leaders were Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Is it significant to you? Is it interesting to you that Miriam is mentioned that way with Moses and Aaron? Why don't we think of Miriam in that way? As one of three leaders that God sent his people.
Well, she doesn't really have her special role.
Okay.
You know, I mean, Erin is, I mean, she, not that we know of, she probably did, but, Erin, we think of immediately as, so the priesthood comes through Erin, and Moses, of course, is the leader overall. But Miriam, what exactly she was responsible for is a little hard to pin down, other than, you know, telling Moses what to do.
That was my first sort of thought about that, is that Miriam's spot, Miriam's significance is sometimes not really explained or extrapolated on in Exodus and Numbers, Deuteronomy.
I wouldn't think Aaron was a leader either without people appealing to him. He's a golden calf.
Okay.
But yeah, there was a story where Miriam was public facing, speaking.
You're right. Aaron does have the role of the priesthood, like Josh said. So he gets a little more exposure, I suppose is a good word, than Miriam does. Go ahead.
I was thinking too, it's because of the discipline she received, you know, having to be outside of the city gates and the leprosy to, you know, because of her complaining about who Moses or what Moses was doing. And I think typically you forget that she was a prophetess, or you forget that she led the women with her dancing and singing, that she was a leader and she rescued, well, not really rescuing Moses as a baby, as Diana talked about, but we forget all of those things because what sticks is the discipline that she's received.
Right. Yeah. That last little sort of last significant event in her life, it's mentioned, Numbers 12. Yeah, I think we don't think of her in for all those reasons. I think we don't think of her in those terms. I want to look at her. You mentioned her being a prophet, and that's what she's called in Exodus 15. So you can turn to Exodus 15, 19 through 21. Somebody want to read that for us? Exodus 15, 19 through 21.
When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on the dry ground. Then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with the timbrels and dancing. To 21, you said?
Yes.
Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horses and driver he is hurled into the sea."
So this is the place where she's identified specifically as a prophet. And this is, of course, after they've come through the Red Sea and the water has rushed back over the Egyptian army and destroyed them, and Israel has come through safe on the other side. And you have this long song, verses 1 through 18, this long song that Moses is credited with. And then you have in 19 through 21, she's called the prophet, Miriam the prophet, has this sort of, the way it's described, it sounds like maybe there's sort of an antiphonal call and response kind of thing. Maybe her song is sort of a response to or a chorus for Moses's song. Maybe it's two separate things. But in what way would you, I mean, you read that and you don't necessarily think, or at least I don't, prophecy. In what way is Miriam acting as a prophet in this episode? The things she says. In what way is she acting as a prophet?
The prophet spoke for God, right?
Okay.
And they were kind of the preachers of their day. She's not really preaching, but she's like a song leader here.
Okay.
And she's a kind of a poet too, I think. And she's composing a song, a songwriter. So she kind of fits into that role a little bit. As a prophet, a leader of the people, leading the women specifically, I guess.
Hello. Come in. Come in.
Sorry.
It's all right.
First of all, driver license.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Patrick.
Rick, nice to meet you.
Ray.
Ricky.
Rick, nice to meet you. Rick. This is everybody behind you online. So.
Oh.
No, you're fine. We're in. Can somebody grab him grab Ricky a Bible maybe? Close by, right down there. On the shelf right there.
Go turn it down for a little bit. Thank you.
We're in the book of Exodus right now, chapter 15.
Exodus 15, okay. Second book of the Bible.
So,
Patrick, one other thing you were saying, why was Miriam sort of ignored? Well, one thing may just sort of be an accident of translation. If we referred to the mother of Jesus as Mary, and if we referred to Mary Magdalene, I'm sorry, if we referred to her as Miriam, and if we referred to Mary Magdalene as Miriam Magdalene, and if we referred to the other Mary by the cross as Miriam, and realized that God chose, presumably, or at least it happened, that Miriam is the mother of Jesus. Well, it's all because of the Miriam, right? And because of that, I think we separate, that allowed us to ignore the fact that these significant New Testament characters are namesakes of the woman who we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And because of that being obscured, I think it's much easier to sort of ignore the influence that Mary had. I mean, when you get to it, that there are two women by the cross, if not three, at the crucifixion and resurrection, all named Mary, two of whom may have been sisters, which means that both of them were named Mary, in the same family. Obviously, at the time, Miriam was important. She was somewhat revered, and that's sort of been lost on us, I think.
yeah, I think you're correct, and that's right. It is interesting that presumably centuries later, millennia later, we have the mother of Jesus is named after Miriam, and so is Mary Magdalene and so forth. So I was thinking about this her role as prophet. Now, Miriam is one of I believe it's 5 women in the Old Testament who are called prophets. We've already met a couple of them, Deborah and Huldah. You may remember from our study. In addition, we have a woman named Noadiah in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 14. She's not a positive character, but she is called a prophet. She sort of opposes Nehemiah's work. In Isaiah 8, we have just an unnamed prophetess, is kind of what she's called. And so, one of 5 women probably in the Old Testament who are referred to in that way. In the New Testament, we have Anna, we have Philip's daughters. But of course, Peter's sermon on Pentecost anticipates that women will prophesy, that would not be surprising when the Spirit comes, that you're on all of on all the people, male and female, men and women, I will pour my spirit and they will prophesy. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul acknowledges that women are prophesying in the church in Corinth. He tells them some things about how to do it and how that should look and how that should shake out. But there's no question about the fact that they are prophesying. They are engaging in prophecy. So begs the question, well, what does Miriam do here that is prophetic? So let's talk about prophecy. What is it? What is prophecy? I'm sorry?
God speaking to people.
God speaking through people.
That's what the prophets say. The word of the Lord came to me, and this is what it is.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of describing it. In prophecy, God chooses someone and speaks through them, gives a message to the people through that person. We sometimes think of prophecy as it requires, we even use it sort of colloquially to talk about sort of somebody who can sort of predict the future, and while there's a piece of that in the Bible, and certainly there is something in a lot of prophecy that has to do with what's going to happen, all of that is secondary to getting the message across. And not always is there a predictive element to prophecy. I mean, sometimes the prophet just says, here's what's going on. Here's what, maybe here's what God's going to do, but it's not really about the predictive element. It's about God sending a message, God wanting his people to hear a message. So you have this little song that Miriam sings. I said little song like it's better than anything I could write, but this song that Miriam sings that seems like what it's doing is it's reminding the people, here's what's happened. And prophecy can sometimes take that nature as well. God has done something, and you need to see this. God has done something, and you need to recognize what God has done, and you need to take comfort in that, or you need to be awed by that, or you need to worship because of that. This thing that you've just seen happen, she's saying, isn't like something that was accidental. It's not just bad luck for the Egyptian army. It's not just, we happened to catch low tide and walk through the water, and then the high tide came and swept the army away. God acted. And so I think the prophetic nature of her song is that she's able to say, look what God did. Let's worship him. Let's honor him. Let's praise him. And let's let that sort of shape who we're going to be as we live in the desert for 40 years, as we they weren't thinking 40 years at the time, of course, but as we go to the promised land, as we travel through this inhospitable wilderness, let's remember this moment and let's celebrate it, and let's remind one another what God has done.
And they need reminding, because right after that, you see that right away, they don't have meat, they don't have water. They've had this miraculous thing happen, and they know that God did it, but yet they're grumbling because they don't have the pots of meat that they had in Egypt. Well, but you were also slaves.
Yeah, right.
So
What hits me is the similarity between Moses's song and Miriam's song. And of course, I don't know the background of it, if he's just talking to the men, but it seems like she's echoing what the truth is. Now the women are taking hold of it, and she's leading them. She's reminding them of what was going on. Of course, the song is shorter than Moses' song, but it's still the same intent about hurling the horses and the chariots into the sea, and God is almighty, and that we should exalt him. And I don't know, the similarity there is striking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know, Patrick, did you see anything as to whether or not, I mean, Miriam's song is basically verse 1 of the previous song.
Yeah.
So is this sort of Hebrew ellipsis that basically she picks up the whole song? I mean, they're not going to rewrite the whole song, and so they just do verse 1, or is this sort of like, I mean, on its face, it sort of reminds me of like Gettysburg, where Everett got up and spoke for 2 hours, and then Lincoln got up and spoke for 5 minutes, and sort of like Miriam sort of saying, everything you said after verse 1 ain't necessary, and we'll very, very focused on what the most important part was. But I thought, well, but maybe it's just a space-saving technique here, and we're supposed to assume that she and the women continued on with the rest of the song in response. Or is it just like the sort of church, here's the responsorial bit, which is always shorter? I don't know if you saw anything.
The suggestion I saw, based on the fact that she says the word for sing isn't used, it's she answered. And so that makes you think that maybe it's a call and response kind of thing that's happened here. I want to just point out something, though, that I thought was really interesting, because I always thought of, okay, Moses leads the men in worship, and then Miriam comes in and leads the women in worship. Actually, Miriam leads the women in the dancing and the timbrels and stuff. But the text says that Miriam sang to them, and them is not feminine. Them is masculine. Miriam sang to all of them, and the imperative, sing to the Lord. It's a masculine plural, all of you. So what the grammar suggests is that Miriam in her part is leading everyone and is encouraging everyone to celebrate, to sing, to praise God for what he's done, and to recognize that what he's done is this miraculous deliverance that can only have come from him. So I mean, I think the prophecy aspect of it for her is that she is giving context. She is, and that's important, as you pointed out. We need that in our lives. We need people who will say, look at what God has done. Look at what God is doing. People who have that ability, have that vision to sort of say, I know, things look dark. I know things look discouraging. I know that things can be tough, but God is at work. And I think God often uses his people, gives his people the ability to do that. And you know people who do that well, right? You know people who do it very well, who are always constantly calling us to see what God is doing and praise him and thank him and take heart in his faithfulness. So I want to put that out there as one of many pieces of what prophecy can look like, because I think we sometimes discount the idea of prophecy because we think it's something that it's not. It doesn't have to, be, somebody falling into a trance, and it doesn't have to be this miraculous prediction that none of us are going to live long enough to see if it comes true anyway. It often, I think, takes this kind of form. Here's what God's doing. Do we see this? Do we see what God's up to? Do we see this possibility that we have? Do we see that he's opened the door for us? Do we see that we can be a part of this? And I think that's a really important bit of this to take away. Thoughts or comments?
interesting that it mentions that she is a prophet before her song. It doesn't say the same about Moses before.
That's true. And I think the reason she's identified as prophet there is because it is this song that we're supposed to see in this song her role, her piece, which is what led me to think of that, because in other places we don't see her acting in this prophetic way necessarily.
It makes her challenge of Moses later, they go out for sins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I want to look at that in just a second too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you're
Yeah, I want to, yeah, we're gonna, I thought we, yeah, I definitely want to talk about her challenge of Moses and what happens there. But other comments or other thoughts about her in this moment before we move on?
I think what's, looking back on prophets in the Old Testament, the predictions of the future, it was always the consequence of God's message.
Yeah.
Because you have sinned, and prophets, they go into varying levels of detail about how horrible Israel's sins are, blah, blah, blah. And then you get to, because of that, you'll be delivered into exile or whatever. So the prediction of the future isn't even central to the message. It's scare tactics. It's fire and brimstone time. This is how you know that God's taking this seriously.
And it's interesting when those predictions did happen, there seems to be often some room that maybe if we repent, maybe God won't do this, that maybe it's not set in stone. Now that doesn't always happen, but sometimes that seems to be the case. Maybe if we just do this, then maybe God will relent and we won't face this thing.
Yeah, why else would God tell people?
Right.
Things?
Yes. Yeah.
It's giving time there.
Right.
What stands out to me looking at this, the significance of singing a song to the Lord, and that in this singing is the praise, is the expectation of his people, is to win a fight. We're singing about everything and how that is to honor God, which seems very, of course, prevalent in scripture, that we sing songs to God. We praise him in these songs. Of course, David, the Psalms tell us that, but I love seeing this with Miriam and Moses, the significance of singing a song to God. And the song is of praise, but it's also of expectation. It's also of remembering what he's done and brought them through, and how the importance of singing elevated God's people and also praise God. I think that's good.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking of one of the Psalms, sing to the Lord a new song.
Mhm.
Well, why do you sing a new song? What's wrong with the old stuff? Why do you sing? Well, because God's done something, right? And that's what you see here at the Red Sea.
Mhm.
They're singing a new song because they don't have one in the archives that fits what God has done here. So we got to sing a new one. We got to sing about what God has done now. Revelation talks about the song of Moses and the Lamb, right? And God's people, that's what we do. We praise and we sing and we celebrate. They're dancing here, right? If Sunday somebody gets up and dances, we might sort of raise our eyebrows, but that's what they're doing here, right? They're dancing in celebration of what God has done.
To bring a tambourine.
Yeah, right. I don't know about that, but yeah, the sense that we need to celebrate, and the fact that this is prophetic also, it reminds me of what Paul says both in Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5, where he talks about in Ephesians 5 being filled with the Spirit, and so sing. And in Colossians 3, let the word of Christ dwell among you as you sing praises to God. You see, I think that sort of biblically, both in the Old and New Testament, one of the assumptions is when God does something and when the Spirit fills us, and that singing is a response. It's a way we proclaim. It's a way we give context, and it's a way we remind one another of what God has done and to find some hope in it. Other thoughts?
It might not seem so strange to us if we were in the medieval period.
Might not seem so strange to us if what?
We were in the medieval period history, there's a lot of served ethics.
Matt pointing out that often in certain times in history, medieval period particularly, these things were often preserved, these deeds were often preserved in epics and songs and poetry. And I think that's been true throughout the world and throughout history. That one of the ways you remember is you make music. Laura always says that she should find a way to put the grocery list to music, because I would remember it that way, because I remember song lyrics. I don't remember the grocery list necessarily. Maybe there's something to that. Other thoughts? Well, let's look at Numbers chapter 12. Because like most of us, Miriam isn't perfect. And so Numbers chapter 12, verse 1 begins this way. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. And I love this verse 3. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. It always makes me laugh a little bit. You know, he's the humblest guy he knows, right? So what are they complaining about? I mean, we're not real certain what the problem with the wife is. Moses' wife and or wives, it's a little bit hard to untangle. Moses married Zipporah, of course, they remember, when he had left Egypt and had taken refuge in Midian. He married the daughter of a local chieftain, I guess, Jethro, and also known as Ruel or Hobab. But anyway, he married this woman in the land of Midian, and
She was a non-Israelite.
she was a non-Israelite, correct?
They wanted purebred.
There is a whole really strange moment in Exodus 4 when Moses is sent back to Egypt, and Zipporah, his wife, goes with him and their kids, and God is going to kill Moses until Zipporah circumcises the son, we think, like right there on the spot, and does something, and God, backs off. And at some point, it seems like Moses sent Zipporah and the kids back to Midian. Because we also have later in, where is it? In, well, I can't remember now where it is. But there is a moment when Jethro comes back into the camp, apparently with Zipporah and the kids. And that's when he suggests that Moses needs some help, needs some people to help him deal with the demands of leading the Israelites. God sends his spirit on 70 elders, and you may remember that story. What we don't know is, did Zipporah stay? We don't know if the Cushite wife is Zipporah. Now, Cush can be. We would generally think of Cush as being what we know of as Sudan, but Cush could also be a region in the land of Midian. Cushan is mentioned as a region in the land of Midian. So all that to say, we don't know exactly who this wife is, whether it's Zipporah or whether it's a different wife. But for whatever reason, Aaron and Miriam are unhappy with Moses's Cushite wife.
Well, to toss something in, right?
Yeah.
As to the identity, I mean, it sounds like it's a newer wife, not an old wife
It seems that way. Yeah.
But I think it's important for our idea here is that I think the Septuagint authors, they translated this as Ethiopian,
Yes.
right? And the King James picked up Ethiopian, which in many people's minds would probably have brought in the idea that Moses married a woman of color here. And I think whether that's true or not, I think that possibility is something we need to keep in mind when we think about how this text has been handled.
And
Down the road.
Cush would if it's not Midian, Cush would almost certainly assume that she was a darker skinned person. She was a woman of color. So of course we would probably assume Moses was as well, but yes. So whatever the cause, whatever it is, Miriam and Aaron have taken offense to this wife. And the way they put it is, well, it's not like God doesn't speak through us too. What do they say?
We're prophets.
We're prophets. Moses ain't so special. Moses isn't so unique. God speaks through us too. So I think they're implying, why does he get to just do whatever he wants? Why is this okay? And again, I don't know what the objection is, whether it's because she's a foreigner, as someone said. If so, it seems an odd time to object at this point in the story. But in any case, for whatever reason, they have this objection to her, and they couch their objections in terms that basically say, Moses, you answer to us too, and God doesn't only speak through you.
Well, they're obviously jealous. They're obviously jealous of Moses, it seems to me.
Maybe some jealousy that they don't get the kind of credit, or they're not out in front, perhaps, kind of the way Moses is. So the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out to the tent of meeting, all three of them. So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent, summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? What's God's response? What's the response there?
Actually, he is special.
He is special, actually. He is unique in some ways, yeah.
Yeah, they're not wrong, but they're not taking everything into account that they should.
Okay.
But the background that we read, it seems that what they've said is true. God does speak through them as well,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that they can usurp his authority.
Yes. Moses has this relationship with God that is not like God's relationship with his other prophets, whether we're talking about Miriam or Aaron or whoever else. I think it's interesting that often prophecy does come in the Bible in the forms of parables and riddles and strange acts that require interpretation. They require God's people to say, all right, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're hearing. But Moses has this authority to speak for God, that God speaks through him. That is unlike anything else. And so, when you start talking about a prophet like Moses, maybe that's what we're getting at, right? this prophet that is not just the run-of-the-mill type of prophet, but the prophet that has this connection with God, is faithful in all his house, and has this connection to him that is different.
And that's the dialogue that's going on here. But the actions, basically, if you read the actions and set aside the dialogue a little bit, what happens is Moses, marriage, possibly with a woman of color, somebody objects, and the anger of the Lord burns against them. Now, that would be a very uncomfortable point for many people to preach on, for a lot of this country's history. Right? I mean, we wouldn't want to talk about this story too much, especially with the King James clearly identifying the woman as an Ethiopian. And contrary-wise, maybe it's a story that we should highlight a little bit more now, as a very good story to tell when it comes to racial discrimination and possibly discrimination on the basis of skin tone and the like. Certainly among the church, the issue is, from Paul's standpoint, is whether somebody's a Christian, not what type of ethnicity they have or where they're from. We still do have that suggestion, but sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. That's right. David points out, how do we know Moses wasn't a person of color? I kind of think we would think so. Well, I would think so. I shouldn't say we. I kind of think I would think so. If I just saw Moses walking down the street and somebody asked me to describe it, I think I would probably feel that he was.
Which is why I actually said it was racial. It's clearly racial because it's so clearly mentioned. For one characteristic is she is a not us. She is Cushite, right? She is a different person. So it could have a color element in it. I think people in the past might have perceived it because of the way the King James Version translates it as having a color element in it. But
ethnically,
it's clearly racial.
Ethnically, at least she's different, right? At least she's from a different place. She's from a different people, a different culture. And perhaps that is, though it's not ever explicitly stated, but it sure seems like that's the objection they have, that she's Cushite.
Patrick, I have a question. Was the fact that she was a person of color important, or was it she was not an Israelite?
Again, I mean, if a person of color is always something that is subject to interpretation, right? I mean, it's always something.
Use that term.
They wouldn't have used the term. They wouldn't have used it at all. I don't know. I mean, it seems to emphasize that she is Cushite. It seems to emphasize whatever that means, whether from what we would think of as the Sudan or what they would have thought of as Midian. It is that otherness that seems to be emphasized.
Well, and then you get to deal with Ezra the scribe. In his prohibition of intermarriage.
Yes. I was just about to ask, is it wrong for an Israelite to marry a non-Israelite?
According to some of them, yeah.
It's very consistent.
In the old law, is it, in the Old Testament, is it wrong?
They were in the pedigree. They wanted the pure line.
And yet,
They traced us all the way back to Moses' day.
yet we have Jesus with his line has a Moabite in it, and so I mean, there is certainly, you're certainly going to sort of look askance at the thing, right? Especially if Moses is out in front and there's a whole, I mean, they're moving through to the promised land where they're going to displace other ethnic groups. I mean, I think there's a very real sense probably that we're exclusive, we're different, we're not them, they are other. And we don't wanna get our priorities mixed up here, Moses. We don't wanna get all tangled up in these matrimonial ties that might make us lose sight of the goal, lose sight of what we're doing here. If that's the case, if that's the way what they're thinking, God puts a different perspective on it. Linda, were you trying to say something? I think you're muted. You're muted, I think, I think you're muted, Linda.
How about now?
Now I got you.
Okay,
Now
I
I hear
just
you.
have a question. Do you think climate had anything to do with a person's color? You know, back in,
I don't know that I'm qualified to say much. I mean, I probably, perhaps, but I don't know. I don't know how you would, I don't know. I don't know how you would untangle that. I'm no geneticist, so I couldn't speak with too much authority on that.
Well, one thing we do know, if Miriam wasn't white at the beginning of the story, she's white at the end of the story, right?
what did you say, Ron?
That's the line of the night.
Ron,
He said, one thing we know, if Miriam wasn't white at the beginning of the story, she's white at the end of the story. She is because God's judgment on her is leprosy. And it describes that her skin was leprous. It became as white as snow.
Why doesn't Aaron get leprosy too?
And that's an interesting question. I thought of that too.
He doesn't get leprosy
You know,
because he can't.
Yeah,
he would
I
become
suspect
unclean.
because if you give the high priest has leprosy, suddenly you got a problem with,
Oh.
who's in charge in the tabernacle, because he can't be in there if he has
But
leprosy.
I would suggest that the punishment does lend some credence to the idea that color was involved in this.
Could be. I mean, leprosy is.
I mean, the choice of punishment such that, oh, you think you have to be white? You know, here, you're white.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, that white as snow descriptor comes up in pretty much in many commentary, in many contexts when leprosy is mentioned. So, maybe, I mean, certainly I don't think you can rule out that possibility.
Ruling for
Yeah.
intent with Moses, and they use this as an excuse, or was this really the catalyst?
It almost seems like what's really at the bottom of it is this jealousy that God didn't just speak through Moses. And maybe it comes out because they have this objection to the wife that he's not.
I don't get.
What I was,
Go ahead, Kelly.
Go ahead.
No,
what
go
I
ahead.
was thinking, as I'm reading this, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife. And I'm sensing prejudice. I'm sensing racism more than I am jealousy. That there is a prejudging because of this woman's ethnic background, racial background, whatever we want to call it. And God then steps in with them. He calls them for a meeting face to face. And he says, hey, look, all of my prophets, we are afraid to speak of, but for sure, Moses, because he's been given special privileges and because of this. But I see prejudice, that's the first part of it. But I also, when we were talking earlier, I think God wouldn't want us speaking ill towards any prophet. And this is just more pronounced because of the prejudice and because Moses is special, because of the special privileges given him. But I think that stands out to me as the racism or the prejudice is more of it than a jealousy.
And I agree with Colette on this, but I find it surprising that this story is looked at as sort of to Miriam's discredit. I mean, obviously she got something wrong and she gets punished for it. But look at the reaction of Moses and Aaron.
Mhm.
They obviously love their sister.
Yeah.
Right? They are really upset about what happened, both of them, including Moses, who she was speaking against. I mean, if that's not a tribute to Miriam, I don't know what is. I mean, they are honestly upset. It's not like they're going to hang her out to dry. And so she has it. She's outside the camp for 7 days, right? As if somebody had spit in somebody's face, a very short period, and everybody waits for her.
Yeah, I like that line at the end.
She's important, right, to everyone. And then she comes back in. And, you know, I know people, everybody has feet of clay, right, except one. And I think this is, as I said, I think this is sort of a tribute to Miriam, the reaction to what happens even when she messes up. She must have been really loved and respected by people.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I'm impressed with both how Moses and Aaron react, and also I noticed earlier a day or two ago, I noticed that line at the end, and people didn't move on until she was back in the camp, and that is a tribute. I think you're correct. That is a tribute to her.
There's no shun for it.
Yeah, right. There's no, boy, couldn't have happened to a nicer lady, nothing like that. It's sorrow that this has happened. Moses in particular, it seems just like horrified that God would do this. He just can't see how God would do this. And maybe that goes back to the line about his humility, but it just, to him, it just seems just horrifying. And he immediately says, Lord, please heal her. Please, God, heal her. And Aaron says the same. Don't hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed. Maybe that's why Aaron didn't get leprosy too. He's quick to, he sees his sister has it. And he's quick to his criticism right away.
He seems to have skated away from some difficult situations with the golden calf.
Yeah. He's the Teflon priest. Nothing sticks to it, right?
That's qualities that we're not appreciating.
Yeah. Well, all right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good to hear your thoughts, and don't